That everyone should obey his mother and father seems a good thing, and I certainly recommend it. However, let us see what this matter of obedience is, or rather first, what is the nature of disobedience, and let us consider who the disobedient person is, if in this way we may better understand what the nature of obedience is. Now then, take this case. If a father who is not a physician and not experienced in matters of health or sickness should prescribe for his invalid son something which was harmful or injurious, and the son was aware of that fact, surely, in not following his father's prescription, he is not disobeying and is not disobedient, is he? It would not seem so. Or again, suppose the father himself were ill and should demand wine and food, which he ought not to have, and which probably would aggravate his illness if he took it. And his son, realizing this, would not give it to him. Surely he is not disobeying his father, is he? Certainly one cannot think so. And yet I fancy one would consider far less disobedient than, in this case, the man who, having a money-loving father, is ordered by him to steal or make away with money entrusted to him, but does not carry out the order. Or do you think that there are no fathers who give such orders to their children? Well, I know a father so depraved that, having a son conspicuous for youthful beauty, he sold him into a life of shame. If now that lad who was sold and sent into such a life by his father had refused and would not go, should we say that he was disobedient, or that he was showing purity of character? Surely even to ask the question is scarcely necessary. To be sure, disobedience and the disobedient person are terms of reproach and shame, but refusing to do what one ought not to do merits praise rather than blame. Therefore, whether one's father or the archon or even the tyrant orders something wrong or unjust or shameful, and one does not carry out the order, he is in no way disobeying, inasmuch as he does no wrong nor fails of doing right. He only disobeys who disregards and refuses to carry out good and honourable and useful orders. Such is the disobedient man. But the obedient person behaves in just the opposite way, and is completely different from him. He would be the kind of man who listens to anyone who counsels what is fitting and follows it voluntarily. That is the obedient man. Thus, in relation to his parents also, one is obedient when he does voluntarily whatever they counsel that is good and fitting. For my part, moreover, I should say that anyone who did what was right and expedient, even when his parents did not counsel it, was obeying his parents, and in support of my reasoning, consider this. In my opinion, the man who does what his father desires and follows his father's wishes is obeying his father. And he who does what he ought and pursues the better course is following the wish of his father. How is that? Because surely all parents have the interests of their children at heart, and because of that interest, they wish them to do what is right and advantageous. Consequently, one who does what is right and useful is doing what his parents wish, and so is obedient to his parents in doing it, even if his parents do not order him in so many words to do these things. This is one thing only, and nothing else should he take into consideration who wishes to obey his parents in each act. Whether what he plans to do is good and advantageous. Thus, if such a conviction be entertained, whatever a man's action may be, it's the act of one obedient to his parents. And so you, my young friend, do not fear that you will disobey your father, if when your father bids you to do something which is not right, you refrain from doing it, or when he forbids you to do something which is right, you do not refrain from doing it. Do not let your father be an excuse to you for wrongdoing, whether he bids you to do something which is not right, or forbids you to do what is right. For there is no necessity for you to comply with evil injunctions, and you yourself seem not unaware of this. You would certainly not submit to your father in musical matters if, with no knowledge of music, he should order you to play the lyre incorrectly. Or if he knew nothing of grammar and you did, he should order you to write and read, not as you had learned, but otherwise. And if, finally, with no knowledge of how to steer a ship, he should order you, who did understand to handle the helm in the wrong way, you would not heed him. Well then, enough of that. Now if your father, knowing nothing about the subject, should forbid you, who had learned and comprehended what philosophy is, to study philosophy, would you be bound to heed him, or would you not rather be obligated to teach him better, since he is giving bad advice? That seems to me to be the answer. Perhaps by using reason alone, one might persuade his father to adopt the attitude he ought in regard to philosophy, if the father's disposition is not too obstinate. If, however, he should not be persuaded by argument, and would not yield, yet even then the conduct of his son will win him over, if his son is truly putting his philosophy into practice. For as a student of philosophy, he will certainly be most eager to treat his father with the greatest possible consideration, and will be most well behaved and gentle in his relations with his father. He will never be contentious or self-willed, nor hasty or prone to anger. Furthermore, he will control his tongue and his appetite, whether for food or for sexual temptations, and he will stand fast in the face of danger and hardships. And finally, with competence in recognizing the true good, he will not let the apparent good pass without examination. As a result, he will willingly give up the pleasures for his father's sake, and for him he will accept all manner of hardships willingly. To have such a son who would not offer prayers to the gods, who, having one, would not love him because of whom he had become an envied and most blessed father in the eyes of all men of sound judgment. If then, my young friend, with a view to becoming such a man, as you surely will if you truly master the lessons of philosophy, you should not be able to induce your father to permit you to do as you wish, nor succeed in persuading him. Reason thus: your father forbids you to study philosophy, but the common father of all men and gods, Zeus, bids you and exhorts you to do so. His command and law is that man be just and honest, beneficent, temperate, high-minded, superior to pain, superior to pleasure, free of all envy and malice. To put it briefly, the law of Zeus bids man be good. But being good is the same as being a philosopher. If you obey your father, you will follow the will of a man. If you choose the philosopher's life, the will of God, it's plain, therefore, that your duty lies in the pursuit of philosophy rather than not. But you say your father will restrain you and actually shut you up to prevent your study of philosophy. Perhaps he will do so, but he will not prevent you from studying philosophy unless you're willing. For we do not study philosophy with our hands or feet or any other part of the body, but with the soul, and with a very small part of it, that which we may call the reason. This God placed in the strongest place, so that it might be inaccessible to sight and touch, free from all compulsion and in its own power. Particularly, if your mind is good, your father will not be able to prevent you from using it, nor from thinking what you ought, nor from liking the good and not liking the base, nor again from choosing the one and rejecting the other. In the very act of doing this, you should be studying philosophy, and you would not need to wrap yourself up in a worn cloak, nor go without a chiton, nor grow long hair, nor deviate from the ordinary practices of the average man. To be sure, such things are well enough for professional philosophers, but philosophy does not consist in them, but rather in thinking about what is man's duty and meditating upon it. Lecture 17. What is the best viaticum for old age? At another time, when an old man asked him what was the best viaticum for old age, he said the very one that is best for youth too, namely, to live by method and in accord with nature. You would be best understand what this means if you would realize that mankind was not created for pleasure. For that matter, neither was the horse or dog or cow created for pleasure, and all of these creatures are much less valuable than man. Certainly a horse would not be considered to have fulfilled its purpose by eating and drinking and mating at will, and doing none of the things which are the proper work of a horse. No more would a dog if it simply enjoyed all kinds of pleasures, like the horse did, none of the things for which dogs are considered good. Nor would any other animal if kept from the functions proper to it and allowed to have its fill of pleasures. In short, according to this, nothing would be said to be living according to nature, but what by its actions manifests the excellence peculiar to its nature. For the nature of each guides it to its own excellence. Consequently, it's not reasonable to suppose that when man lives a life of pleasure, that he lives according to nature, but rather when he lives a life of virtue. Then indeed, it is that he is justly praised and takes pride in himself and is optimistic and courageous, characteristics upon which cheerfulness and serene joy necessarily follow. In general, of all creatures on earth, man alone resembles God and has the same virtues that he has, since we can imagine nothing even in the gods better than prudence, justice, courage, and temperance. Therefore, as God, through the possession of these virtues, is unconquered by pleasure or greed, is superior to desire, envy, and jealousy, is high-minded, beneficent, and kindly, for such is our conception of God, so also man in the image of him, when living in accord with nature, should be thought of as being like him, and being like him, being enviable, and being enviable, he would forthwith be happy, for we envy none but happy. Indeed, it's not impossible for man to be such, for certainly when we encounter men whom we call godly and godlike, we do not have to imagine that these virtues came from elsewhere than from man's own nature. If then, by good fortune, while still young, one had taken pains to get right instruction and had mastered thoroughly all those lessons which are considered good, as well as their practical application, such a man in old age, using these inner resources, would live according to nature, and he would bear without complaint the loss of the pleasures of youth, nor would he fret at the weakness of his body, and he would not be irked even when slighted by his neighbours, or neglected by his relatives and friends, since he would have a good antidote for all these things in his own mind, namely his past training. If, however, one should have shared less abundantly in early instruction, but should show an eagerness for better things and a capacity for following words well spoken, he would do well if he sought to hear relevant words from those who have made it their business to know what things are harmful and what helpful to men, and in what way one should avoid the former and obtain the latter, and how one should patiently accept things which befall him that seem to be evils, but are not really so. If he heard these things and acted upon them, for to hear them without acting upon them would be most unprofitable, he would manage old age very well, and in particular he would rid himself of the fear of death, which more than all else terrifies and oppresses the aged, as though they had forgotten that death is a debt which every man owes. Yet it is certain that which renders life most miserable for the aged is the very thing, the fear of death, as even the orator Socrates confessed. For they tell that when someone asked how he was getting on, he replied that he was doing as well as was reasonable for a man of 90, but that he considered death the worst of evils. And yet how could there have been any smattering of knowledge or of acquaintance with true good and evil in the man who thought that an evil which is the necessary sequel even to the best life? The best life, you will agree, is that of a good man, and yet the end even of such a man is death. Therefore, as I said before, If one in old age should succeed in mastering this lesson, to wait for death without fear and courageously, he would have acquired no small part of how to live without complaint and in accordance with nature. He would acquire this by associating with men who were philosophers, not in name only but in truth, if he were willing to follow their teachings. So it is that I tell you that's the best viaticum for old age, is the one I mentioned in the beginning, to live according to nature, doing and thinking what one ought. For so an old man would himself be most cheerful, and would win the praise of others, and being thus, he would live happily and in honour. But if anyone thinks that wealth is the greatest consolation of old age, and that to acquire it is to live without sorrow, he is quite mistaken. Wealth is able to procure for man the pleasures of eating and drinking and other sensual pleasures, but it can never afford cheerfulness of spirit nor freedom from sorrow in one who possesses it. Witness to this truth are many rich men who are full of sadness and despair and think themselves wretched, evidence enough that wealth is not a good protection for old age. Lecture 18a on food. On the subject of food, he used to speak frequently and very emphatically too, as a question of no small significance, nor leading to unimportant consequences. Indeed, he believed that the beginning and foundation of temperance lay in self-control in eating and drinking. Once putting aside other themes, such as he habitually discussed, he spoke somewhat as follows: as one should prefer inexpensive food to expensive, and what is abundant to what is scarce, so one should prefer what is natural for men to what is not. Now food from plants of the earth is natural to us, grains, and those which, though not cereals, can nourish man well, and also food, other than flesh, from animals which are domesticated. Of these foods, the most useful are those which can be used at once without fire, since they are also most easily available, for example, fruits in season, some of the green vegetables, milk, cheese, and honey. Also those which require fire for their preparation, whether grains or vegetables, are not unsuitable and are all natural food for man. On the other hand, he showed that meat was a less civilized kind of food and more appropriate for wild animals. He held that it was a heavy food and an obstacle to thinking and reasoning, since the exaltations rising from it being turbid darkened the soul. For this reason, also the people who make larger use of it seem slower in intellect. Furthermore, as man of all creatures on earth is the nearest of kin to the gods, so he should be nourished in a manner most like the gods. Now the vapours rising from the earth and water are sufficient for them, and so he said we ought to be nourished on food most like that, the lightest and purest, for thus our souls would be pure and dry, and being so would be the finest and wisest, as it seemed to Heraclitus when he said, the clear dry soul is wisest and best. But now, he said, we feed ourselves much worse than the unreasoning brutes, for even if they, driven by appetite as by a lash, fall upon their food, nevertheless they are not guilty of making a fuss about their food and exercising ingenuity about it, but they are satisfied with what comes their way, seeking satiety only, nothing more. But we contrive all kinds of arts and devices to give relish to eating and to make more enticing the act of swallowing. We have come to such a point of delicacy in eating and gourmandise that as some people have written books on music and medicine, so some have even written books on cooking, which aim to increase the pleasure of the palate but ruin the health. It is at all events a common observation that those who are luxurious and intemperate in food have much less vigorous health. Some, in fact, are like women who have the unnatural cravings of pregnancy. These men, such like women, refuse the most common foods and have their digestion utterly ruined. Thus, as worn out iron constantly needs tempering, their appetites continually demand being sharpened either by neat wine or a sharp sauce or some sour relish. But no such man was the Laconian who, on seeing a man refuse to eat a young peacock or other expensive bird that was placed before him, and complain that he would not eat it because of lack of appetite, remarked, "But I could eat a vulture or a buzzard." Zeno of Citium, even when he was ill, thought that no unusually delicate food should be brought him, and when the attending physician ordered him to eat squab, he would not allow it, and said, "Treat me as you would treat my slaves' manes." For I imagine that he had thought there should be nothing more delicate in his treatment than for one of his slaves if he were ill. For if they can be cured without receiving more delicate fare, so can we. Surely a good man should be no more delicate than a slave, and for that reason Zeno very likely thought that he ought to beware of delicacy in diet, and not yield to it in the least, for if he once yielded, he would go to the whole way, since the matter of food and drink, pleasure, accelerates its pace alarmingly. The words spoken on that occasion concerning food and nourishment seemed to us more unusual than the customary discourses day by day. Lecture 18b on food. Thoroughly shameful, he used to say, are gluttony and high living, and no one will dare deny it. Yet I have observed very few aiming to shun these vices. On the contrary, I notice that the majority of people strive to obtain these same foods when they're not available, and when they are at hand, are unable to refrain from them, and they use them so lavishly when they have them that they make for the detriment of their health. And yet what else is gluttony but intemperance in the matter of nourishment, causing men to prefer what is pleasant in food to what is beneficial? And high living is nothing but excess in table luxury. Now excess is always evil, but here particularly it reveals its true nature in these people, since it makes them greedy, like swine or dogs, rather than men, and incapable of behaving properly with hands or eyes or gullet. So completely does the desire for pleasure in dainties of the table pervert them. How shameful it is to behave toward food in this way. We may learn from the fact that we liken them to unreasoning animals rather than to intelligent human beings. Now, if this is shameful, the opposite must be altogether good. That is, exercising moderation and decorum in eating, demonstrating one's self-control, there first of all, not an easy thing to do, but one which requires much attention and practice. Why should this be? Because although there are many pleasures which lure man into wrongdoing and force him to yield to them contrary to what is good, pleasure in eating is probably the hardest of all to combat. For other pleasures we encounter less often, and we can refrain from some of them for months and whole years. But of necessity we are tempted by this one every day, and usually twice a day, since it is not possible for man to live otherwise. Thus, the oftener we're tempted by pleasure in eating, the more dangers there are involved. And indeed, at each meal there is not one hazard for doing wrong, but many. First of all, the man who eats more than he ought does wrong, and the man who eats in undue haste no less, and the man who wallows in the pickles and sauces, and the man who prefers the sweeter foods to the more healthy ones, and the man who does not serve food of the same kind or amount to his guests as to himself. There is still another wrong in connection with eating when we indulge in it at an unseasonable time, and although there is something else we ought to do, we put it aside in order to eat. Since then, these and even more vices are connected with eating. If a man wishes to show self-control, he must be free of all of them and not be guilty of any of them. To keep himself blameless and free from such errors, one should by constant practice accustom himself to choosing food not for enjoyment but for nourishment, not to tickle his palate but to strengthen his body. Indeed, the throat was designed to be a passage for food, not an organ of pleasure, and the stomach was made for the same purpose as the root was created in plants. For just as the root nourishes the plant by taking food from without, so the stomach nourishes the living being from the food and drink which are taken into it. And again, just as plants receive nourishment that they may survive, and not for their pleasure, so in like manner food is to us the medicine of life. Therefore, it's fitting for us to eat in order to live, not in order to have pleasure, if, at all events, we wish to keep in line with the wise words of Socrates, who said that the majority of men live to eat, but that he ate in order to live. Certainly no reasonable being whose ambition is to be a man will think it desirable to be like the majority who live to eat, and like them to spend his life in the chase after pleasure derived from food. That God who made man provided him food and drink for the sake of preserving his life and not for giving him pleasure. One can see very well from this. When food is performing its real function, it does not produce pleasure for man. That is in the process of digestion and assimilation. At the time we're being nourished and renew our strength, but we feel no sensation of pleasure, and yet there is a longer time involved in this process than in eating. Surely if God had planned eating as a pleasure for us, he would have had us enjoy it at a longer time and not merely the brief moment when we're swallowing. And yet for the sake of that brief moment, when we do experience pleasure, countless dainties are prepared, the sea is sailed from end to end, cooks are more in demand than farmers, and some even squander the value of their estates to spread their tables, though their bodies are not at all benefited by the costliness of the food. Quite the contrary, people who eat the cheapest food are the strongest. Indeed, you may notice that slaves are usually stronger than their masters, countrymen than city men, the poor than the rich, better able to do hard work, less fatigued by their labour, less frequently ill, enduring more cheerfully cold, heat, lack of sleep, and every hardship. Furthermore, even if expensive and cheap food strengthened the body equally well, nevertheless one ought to choose the cheaper food because it is more conducive to temperance and more fitting for a good man. In general, for men of sense and reason in respect of foods, what is easy to procure is better than what is hard to obtain. What requires no work than what requires it, what is available than what is not at hand. But to sum up the question of food, I maintain that its purpose should be to produce health and strength, that one should for that purpose eat only that which requires no great outlay, and finally, that at table one should have regard for a fitting decorum and moderation, and most of all, should be superior to the common vices of filth and greedy haste. Lecture 19, on clothing and shelter. Such were his opinions on food. He also thought it best to provide moderate covering for the body, not expensive and superfluous, for he said that one ought to use clothing and shoes in exactly the same way as armour, that is, for the protection of the body and not for display. Therefore, just as the most powerful weapons and those best calculated to protect the bearer are the best, and those which attract the eye by their sheen, so likewise the garment or shoe which is most useful for the body is best, and not one which causes the foolish to turn and stare. For the covering should at once render the thing covered better and stronger than its natural condition, rather than weaker and worse. Those then who acquire smoothness and delicacy of skin by their clothing make their bodies worse, inasmuch as plainly the pampered and soft body is much worse than one that is sturdy and bears evidence of hard work. But those who strengthen and invigorate the body by the clothing they wear Those, I say, are the only ones who benefit the parts of the body so covered. It does not improve the appearance of the body to cover it completely with many garments, to smother it with tight wrappings, and to soften the hands and feet by close-fitting gloves or shoes, unless perhaps in case of illness. It's not good to be entirely without experience of cold and heat, but one ought in some degree to feel the cold in winter and likewise the heat of the sun in summer, and to seek the shelter of shade as little as possible. Wearing one chiton is preferable to needing two, and wearing none but only a cloak is preferable to wearing one. Also, going barefoot is better than wearing sandals, if one can do it, for wearing sandals is next to being bound, but going barefoot gives the feet great freedom and grace when they're used to do it. It's for this reason that one sees couriers wearing no sandals on the highways, and the runners in a contest unable to make the best speed if they have to run in sandals. Since we make houses too for a shelter, I argue that they ought to be made to satisfy bare necessity, to keep out the cold and extreme heat, and to be a protection from the sun and winds for those who need it. In general, whatever a natural cave would offer, furnishing a moderate shelter for man, this our houses ought to furnish for us, with just enough to spare to make a convenient place for storing away man's food. What good are courtyards surrounded by colonnades? What good are all kinds of coloured paints? What good are gold-decked rooms? What good are expensive stones, some fitted together on the floor, others inlaid in the walls, some brought from a great distance at the greatest expense? Are not all these things superfluous and unnecessary, without which it's possible not to live, but also to be healthy? Are they not the source of constant trouble, and do they not cost great sums of money, from which many people might have benefited by public and private charity? How much more commendable than living a life of luxury it is to help many people? How much nobler than spending money for sticks and stones to spend it on men? How much more profitable than surrounding oneself with a great house to make many friends, the natural result of cheerfully doing good? What would one gain from a large and beautiful house comparable to what he would gain by conferring the benefits of his wealth upon the city and his fellow citizens?